Imagine being the only person in a medieval court who could make fun of the king and get away with it. Everyone else around the throne had a reason to be careful. Nobles wanted influence, advisors wanted power, servants wanted to keep their jobs. But then there was the jester, the ridiculous guy in the room who could make jokes about the most powerful person in the kingdom. And sometimes those jokes were more serious than they looked. One of the best examples was William Summer, the famous fool of Henry VIII. Summer appears in Henry VIII's court records from around 1535, and unlike the stereotypical jester from movies, he apparently didn't spend his days walking around in a giant hat covered in bells. Paintings show him looking surprisingly serious. We also know he stayed around the Tudor court for decades, appearing under Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and even at Elizabeth I's coronation. But here's where the story gets weird. One surviving account describes Summer making a joke to Henry VIII about the people handling the king's money. Instead of saying auditors, surveyors, and receivers, Summer supposedly twisted the words into frauditors, conveyors, and deceivers. The joke was funny, but it also carried a message: the people around you are taking your money. Historic England describes this as Summer using his position as the king's fool to tell Henry something uncomfortable that other people at court might not have dared to say. And that's where the idea of the clever jester comes from. But there's a problem. We don't actually know how many jokes Summer made. In fact, historians don't have a surviving collection of his comedy at all. Peter Anderson, a historian at Örebro University who wrote a biography of Summer, points out that many stories about him were written down decades after his death, and some were basically joke book material with his name attached to them. So the real Summer is harder to understand than the legend. He may have been witty. He may also have been what Tudor society called a natural fool, someone with an intellectual disability who was cared for at court. And this distinction matters because the famous image of the jester as a secret genius who could freely insult the king is probably too neat. The reality was much stranger. Court fools could occupy an unusual position around powerful people. Some were performers, some were people with intellectual disabilities, some became companions to rulers. And their humor could sometimes give them a way to say things that would sound very different coming from an advisor. Then you get people like Richard Tarlton, one of the most famous comedians of Elizabethan England. Tarlton is sometimes described as Elizabeth I's jester, but historians generally identify him as an actor who was personally favored at court. He became famous for improvising rhymes and firing quick insults back at audience members. One academic study from Oxford describes this kind of improvised response, called a quip, as one of Tarleton's defining skills. He could take something someone shouted at him and instantly turn it into a cutting joke. That's important because it shows what made these performers special. Their intelligence wasn't necessarily about knowing every subject in the kingdom. It was about reading people, reading the room, knowing exactly how far a joke could go, and knowing when to stop. Because being close to a king wasn't the same thing as being safe. The king still had absolute power over your life. The jester's protection came from his usefulness as an entertainer, not from some universal law saying he could insult the king without consequences. The idea that every jester was basically a medieval political commentator is mostly a later romanticized version of the story. But there is something real underneath it. Humor can make criticism easier to hear. If an advisor tells a king, "You're being manipulated by the people around you," that's a serious accusation. If the king's fool turns the same idea into a joke, everyone laughs, and for a few seconds the king might laugh at himself too. That's the strange power of the jester. He didn't necessarily have more power than everyone else. He just had a different way of using the little power he had, and maybe that's why the character survived in our imagination. The jester looks like the stupidest person in the room, but to survive in a room full of powerful people, you might have to understand that room better than anyone. The bells, the jokes, the ridiculous clothes, they were the disguise. Underneath it was a person whose entire job depended on knowing exactly what people were willing to laugh at. And sometimes, the funniest person in the room was the only person who could point at something everyone else was too scared to mention.